Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SESYNC seminar series. Today we have two speakers, and I will introduce them right before they speak. Our first speaker is Dr. Rachel Mason. She has a very interesting career that many people, even at SESYNC, may not be aware of. She had an incredibly successful, productive career as an astronomer. And her PhD is in astronomy. She was a major player in the Gemini Observatory, which includes two of the largest or best sites for astronomical work. And they're the largest telescopes. One's in Hawaii, which is where she was. And she published extensively, but then decided that she wanted a different career. And she went to University of Vermont and got a degree in plant and soil science. And we're lucky enough that we were able to bring her to SESYNC this past January, where she's working particularly with Andrew Elmore on changes in plant nitrogen, which may be related to increasing CO2, and how that may have cascading effects on herbivores and even humans. She also has an interest in goats and in farming, and she's just a delight to be around. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to tell us, Rachel. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for the nice introduction. I think that most people don't spend much time thinking about nitrogen, but if you do, then you probably think about things like farmers spraying fertilizer on their fields, or maybe you think about these waste pits that hold animal manure from industrial animal agriculture. And maybe you think about this seeping into our waterways and getting into our oceans and causing these big dead zones where nothing can live in the ocean. Maybe you think about harmful algal blooms. And if you really think about nitrogen, then maybe you also think about emissions of nitrogen compounds from factories and from vehicles and also from agricultural fertilizer that get up into the atmosphere and move around the world and settle out onto our forests and lakes. This kind of accidental fertilizer use that we call atmospheric nitrogen composition. And if these are the kinds of things that you think about when you think about nitrogen, then you're not wrong. Excess nitrogen in the environment is a real and serious problem that many people are working very hard to solve. But the thing about this problem is that really it's a problem that is too much of a good thing. Nitrogen, we use so much nitrogen because this element is absolutely essential for plants to grow. So plants use nitrogen for things like making chlorophyll, and they use it for the enzymes that are necessary to do photosynthesis. This is why we put so much nitrogen on our crops, because we need it for them to grow to their maximum potential. And then at the same time, nitrogen is a building block of proteins. In a protein molecule, roughly 1 atom in every 6 is nitrogen. So if you're something like an insect or a grazing animal or even a human that depends on plants for much or all of your protein, then you're going to care about whether plants have enough nitrogen to form this protein. So nitrogen, it's really one of these things that you need the right amount in the right place at the right time. And today I'm going to propose to you that as well as excesses of nitrogen in some locations, scientists are increasingly starting to suspect that there is too little nitrogen, certainly in some locations and maybe globally as a whole. So first I'll walk through some of the evidence that makes us think that this is happening, and then I'll explain some of the consequences for things that eat plants and for a few other aspects of ecosystems as well. So here's our working model. On the left, we have a few large-scale global changes that are taking place at the moment. We have rising atmospheric CO2 levels. We have increasing temperatures. We have changes in rainfall patterns around the world. And also these industrial emissions of nitrogen compounds from factories and vehicles and agriculture, this accidental fertilization that we call atmospheric nitrogen deposition, patterns of that are changing as well. So even if nothing else was going on, if it was just rising atmospheric CO2 levels, for reasons I'll come to in a moment, that alone should give us lower concentrations of nitrogen and therefore protein in plant tissues. And that would come to be a problem, we think, for things that depend on plants for protein. But when you add that to all these other global changes, there's also evidence that the supply of nitrogen from soil to the roots of plants and into plants may also be decreasing. And if you think about it, nitrogen is essential for plants to grow. And when we make calculations of things like, well, how much greenhouse gas emissions can humans afford to produce before we hit really dangerous thresholds in global temperatures, then we're making assumptions or doing estimates about the amount of CO2 that can be sequestered by forests as they grow. So if there's a chance that nitrogen might be limiting that growth, then that's something we really need to know about. So this is the basic model that I'm going to walk on, the model or the hypothesis that I'm going to walk you through today. I really need to acknowledge that there's any number of processes and mechanisms and details and interdependencies, relationships and feedback loops that are going on in here, which I'm not going to get into. I mean, these are the conceptual models that our group has been putting together to try and understand this process. And honestly, in the end, it all kind of looks a bit like this. So in the interest of communicating with a broad audience and also not keeping you here until next week, I'm just going to be pulling out the things that I think are the essential things to understand in this area. And I should also point out that our group, you have to keep things manageable. So we have chosen to focus on natural-ish ecosystems like forests and grasslands, which are not being intentionally fertilized by humans. We're not talking about cropping systems, even though the implications of declining nutrient levels in crops for human health is really a fascinating topic in its own right. I won't be talking about crops today. So back to our simple model, let's first take a look at rising atmospheric CO2 levels and how they may lower concentrations of nitrogen in plant tissue. So the thing about CO2 is it's a thing that plants need to perform photosynthesis. So as we put more and more CO2 into the atmosphere, essentially we are fertilizing plants and we're giving them what they need to make more biomass more quickly. And we can see evidence of this in satellite observations like this one on the top left here, which shows what people have started calling global greening, a trend of increasing plant growth in many regions of the world. So CO2 emissions do seem to be fertilizing plants to some extent. But the thing is, if you think about it, so we're giving more carbon to plants, but we're not necessarily giving them more nitrogen. So just even mathematically speaking, the ratio of carbon to nitrogen has to rise in plants. And that means that the concentration of nitrogen must be decreasing. And we see these expectations borne out when we look at things like free air CO2 enrichment experiments. So these are these really cool things where you take a patch of forest and you pump CO2 into it, raising the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere for that forest. And then you spend months or years there taking samples of plants and soils and whatever you're interested in to see what's happening. And these experiments generally do show a decreasing concentration of nitrogen in the leaves of the plants. Of course, it's always more difficult to do this work in natural systems, but even so, we have seen declining nitrogen or declining protein concentrations in some, I'll call them natural forests and grasslands. For instance, on the right, in this study, these people took samples of goldenrod pollen from plants that had been kept in herbaria, kind of plant museums, back to the not 1980s, 1840s. And they find that the protein content of the pollen in these plants has been decreasing as CO2 has been rising. Now, correlation is not causation, of course, but this is entirely consistent with what we would expect from just basic considerations. So that's the very briefest primer on rising CO2 and nitrogen concentration in plants. Now let's take a look at the supply of nitrogen from soil to plants. Because you might have been thinking, well, the air that we breathe is 80% nitrogen. So what's she talking about when she says not enough nitrogen? I mean, how can there not be enough? Okay, well, if you don't get anything else from the next couple of slides, if you just take away that nitrogen supply is complicated, but it may be declining in at least some regions and maybe globally, then that's enough. But let's take a look at some of the details. So the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, plants don't take that up directly. They need other organisms to transform it into forms of nitrogen, like nitrates and ammonium and small organic molecules that they can take up. Nitrogen fixing bacteria can do that. But a lot of the nitrogen that plants take up in natural ecosystems comes from organic matter in the soil. So in a forest, for example, the trees will drop their leaves will become part of the organic matter pool in the soil. And microorganisms in the soil will break down that organic matter into carbon and nitrogen and other things, and releasing the forms of nitrogen that plants can take up as they do so. That's a biological process, which means that it's messy. So it depends on lots of different factors. But one of the big factors that controls how effective, how fast that process occurs is soil moisture. And again, from satellite observations, we know that soil moisture has been increasing in some parts of the world and it's been decreasing in others. And in combination with other factors, that's likely to have an effect on how much nitrogen organic matter decomposition can release to plants and how quickly that happens. Humans are also some of the organisms that supply nitrogen to plants, even when we're not deliberately fertilizing them. This atmospheric nitrogen deposition, the nitrogen from cars and factories and things, that is also very spatially variable. So if we go to China, for example, which is a hotspot of industrial and some agricultural activity, that kind of deposition of nitrogen from the air is high and it's rising. But then if we go to Europe, Central Europe particularly, the factories have dramatically cleaned up their act in the last few decades. So nitrogen deposition from the air there is fairly low and declining. So if you put these things together, maybe it's not too clear what the global picture should be, but it seems reasonable to expect that at least in some locations, the supply of nitrogen from soil to plants should be declining. And this is what we have seen in some locations. So in, I think it's in New Hampshire, the Hubbard Brook experimental forest is a forest which has been really intensively studied back until, I think, at least the 1960s, and maybe earlier than that. And that forest is, it's old, it's mature. So the expectations that people had for that forest is that, well, the trees have pretty much stopped growing. They're not really demanding much nitrogen anymore. So we should see that kind of leftover nitrogen be exported from those forests as nitrates in stream water. So they've been monitoring that for years and years. But as you can see, this is not what's happened. In fact, the nitrogen concentration in stream waters used to be much higher than it is now. And if you take a close look at other processes in the soil, like nitrogen mineralization and nitrification, these are some of the biological processes that make nitrogen available to plants, they have also been declining. And then fluxes of nitrous oxide gas from the soil to the atmosphere, they've been declining as well. It's just as if the amount of nitrogen in this system has been declining and declining over the last few decades. Unfortunately, we don't have this data quality for very many sites at all, this intensive and long-lived monitoring. If we want to look on the continental or global scale, we have to use less direct indicators. But it turns out that nitrogen isotopes are thought to be a reasonably good proxy for the availability of nitrogen to plants. And if we look on the scale of the continental US, then there may have been slight increases in some places, but especially in cool, wet forests, the isotope ratios suggest that nitrogen supply to the trees has been decreasing. And if you go on the global scale, the data are kind of messy, but we see the same kind of signal in there as well. So that's what we think the story is with nitrogen supply from the soil to plants. It appears to be going down in at least some locations and potentially globally. I talked a little bit about how not having enough nitrogen may stop forests growing to their full potential and the significance of that for our calculations of greenhouse gas emissions and what we can safely do. So let's talk for a few minutes about the implications for things that depend on plants for their protein. Let's first look at insects. So I only learned this quite recently, but apparently insects are really sensitive to the amount of nitrogen that's in the leaves that they eat, herbivorous insects anyway, because if they don't get enough protein, then they grow slower. And that means that predators have more opportunity to come in and eat them. So low nitrogen for insects means less chance of survival and reproducing, and that can have a big effect on their populations. there aren't many long-term data sets of insect abundances and plant nitrogen content, but one of them did get published this year. So this is from a prairie reserve in somewhere in the middle of the US, Kansas, I think. And there, people have been going out and collecting grasshoppers since the the early 1980s. And they've also been taking grass samples. And in this paper, what they found was that the grasshopper abundance has been steadily declining at the same time as the concentration of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sodium, has been declining as well. And they, via some sophisticated modeling, they attributed the grasshopper abundance decline to that nutrient dilution, as they put it, and therefore to the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. So that insect apocalypse that you've been hearing about, well, maybe this is part of the problem. But on the other hand, different insect species might react differently. And it turns out that if you take Mongolian locusts, a particular species of locust, and you put them in a cage and you feed them a diet that's high in carbon and low in nitrogen, then they start taking on shapes of the kind of morphology of locusts that are getting ready to swarm. So that other insect apocalypse that you might also have heard of, well, this could potentially, it's plausible that this is part of that problem as well. So let's move on from insects to grazing animals. And 3 of my colleagues did a study recently where they looked at cattle diet measurements derived from 36,000 samples of cattle manure. So all around the US, people who are grazing cattle send cow manure samples to a lab in Texas, where someone dries those samples and grinds them up and prepares them for analysis, for science. And my colleagues took the measurements of crude protein and digestible organic matter that came out of the analysis of those manure samples, and they fed them into a model that researchers use to predict weight gain in cattle. And they found that because the crude protein content in these grasslands all over the US had declined, and the digestible organic matter content had increased, these grazing cattle were gaining weight less quickly than they did in 1995. So let's say you're a rancher in Texas and you're growing cattle and you have a contract to sell them at a certain time, at a certain weight. Then if your cattle don't gain weight at the rate that you expect them to, you're going to lose money. And in principle, you can get around this by bringing in feed for those cows to make up this deficit in protein. But that's going to cost you money. And these researchers estimated that this issue, if ranchers had been fixing it by bringing in supplemental feed, that would have cost the livestock industry $2 billion a year. But at least you can do it. I mean, you probably wouldn't want to because it's expensive, and then there's greenhouse gas emissions associated with transporting the feed, and then you probably have to use more fertilizer to grow the feed, which maybe exacerbates the too much nitrogen problem somewhere. But you can do this. But if you're a herder in Ethiopia, for example, like in this picture, then maybe the option of bringing in supplemental feed isn't even open to you. And if this problem turns out to be serious, that could be a real risk to livelihoods and food security. I would like to say one other thing about mammals, and that's to do with this figure on the right, which looks kind of boring, but is actually amazing. So the story here is that a couple of weeks ago, I was just reading some article about climate change, and they just mentioned in passing, and during an episode of high CO2 50 million years ago, all the mammals became 30% smaller probably because the stuff they were eating was less nutritious. And then it moved on to something else. And I was like, no, hang on, just a second. You can't just say that and move on. What is that? So I asked around a bit and I got hold of some references. And it turns out that this research team and other ones like them have taken fossilized horse teeth from Wyoming. That is the fossils of the teeth of the things that were horse ancestors back then, and done some kind of isotope analysis and made size measurements of these teeth. And from that, they were able to deduce that before and after these periods of high CO2 and warming 56 million years ago and 53 million years ago, the horses did indeed get 15 to 30% smaller. And I don't know about you, but I just have to take a step back for a second and think, isn't it amazing the things that we know and how we know them in science, that you can just take fossilized horse teeth and figure out that 50 million years ago, all the horses became tiny ponies. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. Maybe this isn't one of our most pressing concerns now, but I don't know, science just blows the mind. So anyway, getting back to the more serious stuff, now I'd like to take a look at one of the questions that I know you all have in mind at the moment, which is, what about the fish? And the thing about the fish is that the nitrogen that washes off the land, when there's too much of it, it's a problem because it creates these harmful algal blooms and it uses up all the oxygen. But at some level, it's necessary to sustain the food web in the ocean and to sustain the fisheries that humans depend on for their livelihoods and nutrition. But so if we were able to clean up all the nitrogen that comes out of our sewage treatment plants and clean up all the nitrogen that runs off farm fields, and then underneath that, there was a generally declining level of nitrogen availability in ecosystems and less nitrogen coming out in streams and going into the ocean, could we actually get to a point where there was too little nitrogen in the ocean? And it turns out that these fishermen in the Narragansett Bay actually think we've reached that point already. They feel that the populations of fish and other seafood in that bay are now too low, and they're actually asking local municipalities to let more nitrogen out of the wastewater treatment plants. So this, for me, raises all kinds of interesting philosophical questions, like what kind of ecosystems do we want, and how would we manage to bring them about, and who gets to decide all of this kind of thing? And this also raises the issue of how do we communicate about this declining nitrogen problem if and when it turns out to be something that we really need to communicate about. Because just imagine going to farmers in the Chesapeake Bay area and saying, look, we know we've been asking you for decades to turn down that runoff. You're killing the ocean, you're killing the bay, you've got to do something about your farming practices. But actually, now we've figured out that the opposite thing is happening, and we would like to use some of your taxpayer money to go into the forests and start spreading some fertilizer. Some of that might all be scientifically defensible and logical and valid, but that conversation would be kind of awkward. So how would we have these conversations? So maybe the question you're really asking at the moment is, who is this we that you're talking about, and what are you actually doing about this problem? So we have a SESYNC pursuit led by Andrew Elmore and myself. And we have a range of expertise and interests in this group. We're interested in coastal ecosystems, rangeland ecology, carbon and nitrogen cycling, and lots of other related things. And the first thing that we're doing is we're trying to organize our own thinking by turning this big ball of spaghetti into a coherent review paper. So that's the first thing we're trying to do. At the same time, we are compiling measurements of foliar nitrogen from the literature and from data repositories that we'll use to really try and pin down the spatial and temporal patterns in nitrogen in plant leaves and answer this question, what is happening? We'd like to make a map similar to this one, which have been done for a few tree species in Europe, but we'd like to make it global, and we'd like to expand beyond forest systems to other kinds of ecosystems as well. And then we'd like to use that data set to start to investigate what causes those patterns, go from what is happening to why is it happening, the rising CO2, the atmospheric nitrogen deposition, the changes in climate. That's going to be really challenging, and we haven't quite figured out how we'll attack it. But I'm optimistic that we'll be able to at least understand the role a couple of those factors are playing. And then beyond that, we are already investigating models that we would use to investigate some of the likely consequences, the what does it mean kind of question. At the moment, we're focusing on forests, insects, and grazing livestock. But there are potential consequences for people's livelihoods, for environmental justice, and for this issue of communication and framing. So we would like to bring in some social scientists as well. But here's the status of the data set. I have 93,000 measurements, and I'm still adding more data. The sampling is very uneven in terms of space and time and plant species, because this is an opportunistic sample. And that presents certain statistical challenges, which we are working through at the moment. We've had some great conversations with SESYNC's data science team surrounding these issues. So that's the status of the project at the moment in this very brief update. And to bring things to a close, I would actually like to share this slide by my colleague Wally Fulweiler at Boston University. And this shows our feelings towards nitrogen versus time. And in the beginning, nobody really cared that much about nitrogen, probably because we didn't really know what it was. But then we discovered how crucial it is for plant growth. And at that point, we actually started having wars over bird droppings in the Pacific, humans. Then Haber and Bosch discovered how to synthesize fertilizer from the nitrogen in the atmosphere using the Haber-Bosch process. And we realized we could produce loads of food. And this was a real high point in our feelings towards nitrogen. But it fairly quickly became apparent that although we were producing loads of food, we were making our water disgusting. And people started to step back a bit at that time. But maybe now we're in a better point in time where we're starting to really appreciate nitrogen again, because we're starting to think maybe it won't be there for us every time that we need it. And I'd like to propose that instead of this nitrogen emotional roller coaster, then maybe we acknowledge that just like you or I and everybody else can be a wonderful person, wonderful, amazing person one day, and then a complete pain the next day. What we should really do is be embracing nitrogen in all of its fascinating complexity. So that's all I have to say at the moment. So I'll hand back over to Margaret. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Please, folks, submit questions in the chat box, and we'll field those. We have about 5 minutes that we can take questions. So I ask people to post them there. And I'll just start, Rachel. I had a couple of questions. One, can you talk a little bit about the role of agriculture? And then second, what about phosphorus? And if you consider stoichiometric relationships?
Oh, wow. When you say the role of agriculture, could you be more specific about that?
Well, I'm thinking, yeah, so the example of, Hubbard Brook and the nitrogen declining in the streams is great. It's a case, but I don't think that's generally the case. So if you look at what's going on in terms of what's coming down the Mississippi basin from the upper Midwest, there's huge amounts of nitrogen. So if you think on a global scale and agriculture is increasing all over the world, is there an imbalance in terms of what's being exported in rivers versus some global redistribution of nitrogen?
I think one thing that's critical there is our concept of how mobile nitrogen is. So one framework that's quite commonly used is the planetary boundaries framework. And there they essentially collapse the entire Earth into a single pixel and say, there's a threshold of human created reactive nitrogen, and we must not step beyond that threshold because that's going to cause problems. But maybe the way to think of it, maybe we can't think of it without adding this spatial dimension. Like, yeah, agriculture and these flows of nutrients down the Mississippi, like you said, they're causing enormous problems. And yet in other places, it seems like the opposite may be starting to happen. And as for what the global balance is, I think that may be an open question at the moment. So yeah, I think we might have to start thinking more in terms of spatial nuances rather than thinking of nitrogen as infinitely mobile and getting everywhere.
Oh, okay, good response. I know there is a group also beginning to look at whether or not there's oligotrophication in rivers. There's some evidence in Europe, but not in the US yet. So we have another question. Merle said, I was intrigued by your call for environmental justice that you mentioned at the end. How might that be factored into your work, even if it's just conceptual?
It seems like basically any environmental problem you come up with, it's always going to disproportionately hit people who can't buy their way out of the problem. That seems like just a general rule. Specifically in this work, I mean, the obvious example is if lower nitrogen concentration in forage is causing cattle to gain weight less slowly, to not be able to thrive, then one obvious implication of that could be that if you're an owner of a small herd of livestock and your livestock are already kind of on the edge, if you're a Mongolian herder or maybe a Kenyan herder, if your livestock are already kind of on the edge and not doing that well, there does come a point where cattle are just not able to reproduce when they're really stressed for protein. And that seems like it's going to disproportionately hit people without the means to just bring in supplemental food. So that seems like an area where environmental, where environmental justice should be a concern. As for formal theories and concepts of environmental justice, I don't know a great deal about that yet. I just have this general impression that it's not fair and we should do something about that.
Okay, we have another question from Maya Alvarez, who works on nitrogen and carbon cycling at UC Davis. And the question is, we've already doubled the amount of nitrogen in the biosphere in the last century and are poised to double it again before 2100. Your talk argues that nitrogen is decreasing in ecosystems. Where do you suggest that increased biospheric nitrogen is going? If it's going to plants as a result of CO2, shouldn't foliar nitrogen increase?
That's a great question. And I suppose I have a sort of a two-part answer. One is that I believe that increases in anthropogenic reactive nitrogen are quite patchy and spatially varied. We're seeing huge increases in China and India, I believe, whereas in Europe, for example, then I believe that these inputs are decreasing. So there's that part to it. And then, the other thing is, this is an empirical question. We can go out there and measure nitrogen concentrations in plants. And if it's decreasing, then it's decreasing. And that's just how it is, even if this fact is difficult to explain. So it could be a combination of nitrogen not being as mobile as we've traditionally expected it to be. And then also there's an observation. It's just how it is. And part of the work that we're doing is trying to understand better what these patterns are across the world and what's really going on with foliar nitrogen.
Rachel, is there sufficient data that could link the spatial differences in atmospheric nitrogen to plant foliar nitrogen? Or is there inadequate data?
I hope so, because that's exactly what we're going to try and do. The measurements that we have at the moment are quite patchy in their coverage, and we're still working through that issue. But we do have certain expectations that, the spatial resolution, I'm not quite sure what that is going to turn out to be in the end, but we do have expectations like if foliar nitrogen deposition used to be high here and now it's declining, then we would expect foliar nitrogen to do this. So we should be able to grid up the problem like that and make some progress.
Well, we want to thank you very much for that really interesting talk, Rachel. So thank you.
All right, thank you.